always missing was a linkage between those activities and resources on one hand and the end state on the other. And nothing has changed in that regard, unfortunately. I think the one thing that has changed is I actually think I overrated some of the tactical successes that the U.S. military had. And I used to work for the Department of Defense. I know you're a veteran, so it's not a comfortable thing to say, but a lot of information has come out about how unchallenged a lot of Iranian strikes on U.S. bases and infrastructure in the region were, in a way that really troubles me.
Actually, let's jump to that real quick, because there's been a lot of conversation recently about munitions shortfalls. Just today, there was an article. I mean, recently we've seen, I think it was CSIS talked about Patriot interceptor shortages and THAAD shortages. Today, Reuters talked about PRISM and ATACMS. I think Tomahawks is constantly on that list. What's your view of that? Because I know it's a little bit of a tricky subject, looking at it's classified data, so we don't actually know. How do you view the interceptor munition shortage question right now?
Yeah, I mean, the people who know have been having this concern about what's called sort of magazine depth shortages for a decade and a half or more. Have seen that actually we're entering this world where a war with China would be pretty serious, war with Russia would be pretty serious, North Korea, and handling war with any one of them with the munitions that we have and the production lines that we have would be a huge challenge. And this war has really exposed that. We've expended huge proportions of key precision munition magazines in a way that shows that if the war with China were to happen, we all hope it doesn't, we'd expend those faster, and we might even be out of many of them by now. And so there's been this movement to re-energize the defense industrial base. It's been a big focus of this administration. The last administration tried to do some things on that front as well, although I think they were very woefully insufficient. So we're in a pretty bad strategic position, but I think it's worth noting that Iran just sort of showed the world that we were already in that bad strategic position. Even if we went to war tomorrow with the pre-Iran munitions that we had, or pre-Ukraine, we would still be facing this because we've over-relied on precision munitions with low production lines, lower output, and we just need a new way of thinking about how to sustain a large war against a great power, because wars against other great powers typically go on for a very long time. They don't last weeks, they last months or years.
So if we squint really hard, there might be some silver lining there in ramping up production over the next couple months or years.
Yeah, it sort of depends on when you hope the war, or when you think the war is at most risk of happening. And that's an open question. But there are efforts to increase these production lines, but I really think what we need is actually a different way of thinking about how we sustain longer wars.
What do you mean? Can you get into that?
If we always rely on high-cost interceptors or high-cost missiles or Tomahawks, that's always going to be a losing battle, because we're never going to be able to create enough of those exquisite, expensive systems. And so even the primes, to their credit, are thinking, how do we produce things like this at cheaper and faster? So you see this new version of the Patriot interceptor that's supposedly going to come out from Lockheed that will be a lot cheaper and faster to produce. You also have the non-traditionals in this space, the Andurils of the world, and other companies like Castilian and Mach and others trying to make large amount of missiles at much lower cost. And there are trade-offs. These aren't just as good as the exquisite missiles, but they don't necessarily need to be. And we really need to embrace these companies and these efforts of the primes from non-traditionals and make sure that they're successful.
It's a weird direction for the defense industry. It feels like for decades it's been bigger, faster, more advanced, and we're almost moving a little bit in the other direction now. More mass-produced, probably not the right term, but just kind of seeing the impact that's had, both with Iran and then Russia and Ukraine. I don't think very many people expected this direction, did they?
No, I think, some people did, but there were different schools of thought about how the first sort of robotic war, which we've now seen play out, continuing to play out in Ukraine, would take place, and what that would mean for more traditional systems. We're still arguing over 100 years later why World War I started. I think we're still going to be arguing about this for a long time, too.
Well, let's argue about it a little bit. Or we won't argue, we'll talk about it. How about that?
Sure, you can argue, too.
Yeah. You mentioned that there wasn't a clear strategy for the war when it kicked off, and there still isn't today. I think a lot of folks would agree with that. I'm starting to see that pop up in more and more publications, even some that have traditionally been, or at the start of the war, were very supportive of President Trump, are getting a little more skeptical. Why? What do you think the issue is here? Because that seems like such common sense. You got to know what you're trying to do before you start something. From where we sit today, why do you think that was not in place or not clear?
Some of it is an American cultural problem when it comes to the use of military force. President Trump isn't the first president that's gone to war with unclear end states and objectives. This is unfortunately a bit of a tradition, is we reach for the club and not really sure what we are planning to get out of it. But in this case, it was particularly egregious. If a war is supposed to start with that end state, within the first 2.5 days, I think President Trump laid out something like 6 different end states, none of which are necessarily, some of which are actually mutually exclusive from each other in the ways that you would actually fight the war. And so if there's no clear end state, not just not delivered to the American people, but also not delivered to the people planning the war in the Pentagon and in Central Command in this case, they cannot then scope a campaign plan towards an end state because they're not sure which one it is. Is it change the regime? Is it just ensure that they can't get to a nuclear bomb? Is it wipe out their missile force? Is it wipe out their conventional forces? All these things require different uses of force. And then another issue was our Israeli partners, who, according to credible media reports, had a pretty major role in, I'm comfortable saying, dragging us into this conflict, sold a rosy picture about what could be achieved on the basis of their intelligence penetration of Iran, which was significant. But now that we've seen under the hood a little bit about what they thought they were going to do, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, I'm not sure how old your listeners are, some of them might not remember, but when he was president, but a very far right-wing figure, religious fanatic, lots of pretty crazy guy. But the Israeli plan was about putting him in power. It was pretty nutty. That they were relying on apparently a Kurdish incursion, which I think would have been a very bad idea from northern Iraq into Iran. Luckily, that was scuppered. But we just had this confused picture. If it starts with, what are we trying to do? And then let's make a plan to do that thing. If the military never had that, they couldn't have been successful in many ways. And we've seen that play out. And now the objectives have settled into, because obviously we've shown that we're not capable of changing the regime right now, at least with things that we're willing to do. Like, we're not willing to nuke Iran, for example, which I think is a good thing. We should not nuke Iran. But if we can't change the regime, those objectives by necessity have to come down, and they're largely focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which was not a problem before the war, and making sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, which was a problem before the war, but in some ways is a more tricky problem, even though we've destroyed a lot of Iranian nuclear facilities or buried them under a lot of rubble, because now, if the Iranian regime has any sense, as I indicated in the article that you referenced earlier, they know they need a nuclear bomb because countries with nuclear weapons do not get regime changed. And now they understand, actually, we do need this thing. So we're in a very unenviable strategic position right now.
Kind of in the camp with leadership, the buck stops with the leader. So President Trump is the one that made the decisions to do all of this, despite or in spite of his guidance. But where does the military fall in here? Because I understand you saying that when the objectives keep changing, the military is kind of pursuing different goals, and it's different. If you're looking for regime change or to seal off some nuclear bunkers or go seize enriched uranium, where does this sit in the military in terms of General Kane or maybe someone else pushing back and saying this is too many objectives or they're changing too fast? There's got to be some ownership there, I would feel.
Well, General Kane has a lot of power in our system as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but not as much as many people think. He is not in the chain of command, for example. He advises the president, the secretary. He chairs the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But at the end of the day, the chain of command goes from the president through the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. And so while I'm sure, and I know that General King, according to reporting, not because of any secret information that I have, was involved in the planning, his ability to sort of put his foot down is very limited. And I'm sure, and this was also in reporting, that he had told the president, listen, here are the risks. Here are the munitions problems that we're facing. But I think the president was also surrounded by a lot of people who have been wanting to attack Iran for years, from the Secretary of Defense to Marco Rubio, who's serving, of course, as both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, and of course this huge lobby in Washington that is a very pro-Israel lobby that has been calling for this war for years, and not just a pro-Israel lobby, but a pro-right-wing Israeli lobby that exists here in Washington. So he was surrounded by people saying, this is going to work, this is going to happen. Now, where the military does have some responsibility and some questions to answer, and frankly there needs to be some accountability, one is this idea of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This is something that we've known the Iranians would try to do in a war or a crisis pretty much since the Islamic Revolution. It's probably something we even talked about when our friends were in charge, the Shahs. Like, this is a risk that in a conflict the strait could be closed. We of course had the tanker wars in the 80s. So this is not an unfamiliar problem or risk. This has been sort of the thing that you plan against when you're planning war against Iran. And so I think the question is why was this handled so poorly, and why does it seem to have not been even thought about by some of our more senior leaders, including the president, who seemed genuinely surprised that this happened. And the second is it's what seems like a failure to learn from Ukraine and to learn from the Ukrainian experience. You see all these Iranian Shahids, these lower cost drones that Iran gave to Russia, and then Russia upgraded and has been using against Ukraine to horrific effect. Iran, of course, has its own Shahids and has seen them perform in the field and has improved their own Shahids. And their Shahids, their low-cost missiles, hit a lot of targets across the Middle East, including American bases and headquarters. And it doesn't seem like most of them were intercepted. Some of them were, probably more than we think, but a lot of them got through it, caused tremendous damage to American military infrastructure in the Middle East. And then only after the war started were we seeing, hey, maybe we should have the Ukrainians come by and give us some of their systems, and maybe we should have them coach us on this. I think that the U.S. military was talking to Ukraine about this before the war started, but didn't really integrate them in planning seriously for such a war and such a contingency. And on top of that, and when you're talking about industry, I mentioned these non-traditional companies. These are these newer defense companies that have been venture-backed, that have come up in the last 15 years. Some of them have been spun off of larger traditional companies as well. They have some pretty amazing solutions to counter drones. And the orders didn't come before the war. The orders only came after the war already started. So I do think the Pentagon and the military have a lot to answer for there as well. But none of this would have changed the outcome when you do not have an end state, when you do not have a strategy.
There's armchair quarterbacking super easy. You and I aren't the ones in the driver's seat having to make life or death decisions, so I want to be cognizant of that. But the Strait of Hormuz closure was one that really caught me off guard, because there was so much commentary right out the gate of we weren't expecting it or we weren't ready for it, and that's just not true. There are so many smart people across the Pentagon, across state, across the intelligence apparatus that are well aware of that. It feels like there's some sort of failure that was still a surprise. I don't know the best way to articulate that, but understanding that the military takes orders from the president, I don't know. It seems like we screwed something up there that we need to pay more attention to, if that makes sense.
Yes, I do think that Congress has a role in oversight here in trying to figure out how that happened. But a lot of it will have to wait for the historians when things start getting declassified in 25 years. But how that became what seems to be a genuine surprise in the White House is something that I would like to know more about, because you're right, it is this thing that we wargamed against, that we prepared against. Now, it could be that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is something that would have required things the president wasn't willing to do. So, for example, invading Iran with ground forces. Because to really reopen that, you have to push Iranian forces back from the coast, all across that coast, by probably, I would guess, 40 kilometers or more. Maybe even a lot more than that. That would be a huge contingency, and maybe that was the plan on the books. I don't know, and maybe that's just the thing that the president didn't want to do. I think it's good that we're not invading Iran. I was against this war in the first place, and I think doubling down by this sort of idea that the only way out of this is to double down and go harder and go bigger, and that's going to solve your problems is we've seen that go wrong in our history too, like in Afghanistan. So that's not the answer. But anyway, there's a lot of unanswered questions.
Where would you put the answer? Nothing perfect here, but if the White House we got off this line and then the White House called up and said, Ryan, we're looking for some ideas, what would you advise right now?
The dilemma the White House is in is I really do think the president wants to back down, but feels like it is not acceptable to back down with Iran effectively a veto power over the Strait of Hormuz, which is, of course, where 20% of the world's oil comes through. Oil is a global market, so even though that's not where America gets really its oil, the price of oil is set globally, so it affects our economy, as Americans are feeling right now. It's also where a lot of our allies and friends get their oil. If you look at Asia, South Korea, Indonesia. Indonesia's not an ally, but they're friends. South Korea's an ally. Japan's an ally. Taiwan. The Philippines. They're all suffering economically in huge ways because of this war that we started and because of this issue. So anyway, the White House feels like they can't back down on that issue, and Iran is saying, hey, this is the new dispensation. We now have veto power over what goes through the Strait of Hormuz, and we're not going to give that up. So I think that's where the administration is caught right now. But my advice would be find a way to end this, and that will require making concessions. And as I said in that article in April, and unfortunately it's held up well, we are not a victor determining outcomes, dictating outcomes to Iran. It's actually quite the opposite. Even though we hit Iran really hard, they sustained tremendous losses from leadership all the way down to tactical levels. That's the body count is not what matters. The ledger of things destroyed is not what matters in a war. It's whether you're able to impose a political reality. And unfortunately, Iran is the one that's able to impose a political reality over the Strait of Hormuz. So we're in a really bad position right now. We need to find a way to not double down, not make it worse, but get out of this, which will, again, require concessions, tragically.
It's hard to see that being realistic. I understand what you're saying. I agree. I think we need to probably walk back a little bit and regroup, figure out a better solution here. But that almost sounds like accepting defeat.
Yes. Well, I think it's important to say that that's exactly what it is. It is accepting defeat because we have been defeated. And I do think that it's not politically realistic. What I've recommended is, I think, the most realistic thing because it's in touch with the real world. But of course, the politics of Washington, and particularly in the Republican caucus, are quite different. The Republicans in the House and the Senate, by and large, are very much more hawkish than the American people, much more hawkish than the American electorate. So it is unlikely that they will be willing to tolerate the president backing down. But this is something that is not up to them. This is something that is up to the president. So that's just where we are, unfortunately.
A little bit out of his control at times, it seems. I mean, we've had this back and forth in recent days that everybody's used to at this point. There's talks ongoing, and Iran just says, what are you talking about? And then fires a few more drones and missiles as ships in the Strait of Hormuz. So it's not even clear that we have a lot of leverage right now, maybe as much as we could have had at the beginning of the conflict.
We don't have leverage, but we do have control over our own actions. But you're right that we don't. There is some leverage that we have. There are things that we can do that would make the Iranians very unhappy, but we don't have a lot of leverage. They have more leverage than we do right now. It's much easier to understand what's going on. This isn't a partisan statement, but by not paying attention to anything the president says, because he is just not a reliable source of truth about the state of negotiations. And your listeners can take that how they want to, but it's much easier to understand what's happening by pretty much ignoring everything the president's saying and just watching what's actually happening.
So if we play this out and say that tomorrow we get an announcement that we're walking away effectively defeated in this conflict, we still have to consider Iran in future strategic plans. This threat doesn't go away. Is this something that we look back on in a few years and try to re-engage in a different manner? Or what's the big lesson learned here? Again, because that threat will persist.
Yeah, and it's going to get worse. They will reconstitute. And I do think that they will probably try to dash towards some sort of nuclear weapon capability. And the Middle East is going to become a more dangerous place. We had a playbook on how to handle this. And a lot of people didn't like it at the time. Most Americans did. 60% of Americans were in favor of it. But this was the nuclear deal that President Obama struck with Iran. And it wasn't perfect, but it was a pretty good deal. And a lot of us at the time who were saying, listen, this is a deal that is worth taking for America, were met with better deal, we could have a better deal, or we shouldn't have a deal at all. We really just need to delegitimize the regime and prepare the way for regime change. And my response, and the response of many others, was twofold. Is one, it's kind of like this deal or we definitely go to war. Like, if we don't have a deal like this, the march towards war is unstoppable at some point. And that's exactly what happened. We were mocked for saying that at the time by the detractors of the deal and by the sort of right-wing part of the Israeli political world. But we were right. And the second thing was that, just like with the Soviet Union, the best way to realize regime change was to allow a corrupt system collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. That's what happened with the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. And that's what was going to happen in Iran. You saw these escalating cycles of protest over years. And Iranians were just not willing to put up with this regime anymore. And I think eventually it just would have collapsed. solved itself without us having to attack militarily. What we've done through this new war is perhaps change that cycle, where now we've given Iran the excuse to monstrously repress its population in ways that even it didn't think it was able to get away with before, because it had to care a little bit about the international community in some ways. Not the international community, because everyone, it's kind of a thing that doesn't exist, but what some European powers thought, what other countries thought. Now they can just be very early Soviet, you might say, about how they conduct their repression. And so maybe now that escalating cycle of protest has been stopped. I hope it hasn't, because I do think it's a regime that should go into the trash heap of history. But again, the best way to do that was diplomacy, economic coercion, and allowing this sort of escalating cycle of domestic protest to happen. But anyway, we're in a different world right now, a much scarier world.
That sucks too. Just a personal opinion. I felt like we were doing the right thing for a period of time when it looked like we were going to stand in support of the protesters that were gunned down brutally. And there were some comments made and suggestions that maybe we'd be doing something to support that. But the minute the bombs started falling, it seems like we just dropped that entirely.